Welcome to No Extra Words, One Person's Search for Story. My name is Chris Baker-Darsh. I'm your producer and editor. This is Season 2, Book Pairings. March is Women's History Month, and as I mentioned last week, we are making that our theme for the month as well. We're going to look at a lot of things. We're going to look at women's history, we're going to look at important female writers in history, and we're going to look at historical fiction. And we're starting that conversation today, right where my love of historical fiction started, with the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. These books were published in the 1930s and the 1940s, and they were autobiographical. And they told the story of Wilder's childhood and teen years, so they were set in the 1860s through the 1880s. I want to talk just for a quick minute about definitions, because the librarian in me feels the need to clarify this, because I hear this a lot. People mistake these books for straight autobiography, and they wonder why they are classified as historical fiction since they are about the author's life. Why are they not nonfiction memoir? Memoir is classified as nonfiction. Now, it's normal and expected for memoir writers to shape their story, so to de-emphasize parts of their lives, emphasize other parts of their lives, make the emphasis work for their story, and blur some lines between fact and fiction a little bit. But at the end of the day, memoir is supposed to be a factual story about your life, framed through whatever lens you're watching it through. Anybody who's read memoir a lot knows people who write them play with that boundary quite a bit. The Little House books did start as a memoir. The original manuscript was called Pioneer Girl, and it was rejected by a number of editors. Mrs. Wilder was trying to sell this book right at the very beginning of the Depression, and book publishing had been cut drastically back, and editors just weren't interested in this book. One of the editors who rejected it suggested that it would be good to take the story and reimagine it as a novel for children, or a juvenile, which is what we now call middle grade novels in those days. So there was an intentional decision made to fictionalize the story, to put it in the voice of the character Laura at her different ages, to cut some characters, to combine some characters, to choose what was in and what was out, to make up specific incidents, dialogue, things like that, to turn this pure memoir into fiction. So it's historical fiction. Historical fiction is any fiction written later than it is set. So even though this is her life, it's historical fiction because it's her looking back on it, writing about it 40 to 60 years later, putting it smack in that historical fiction context. Now, if you do want to read the original manuscript, Pioneer Girl, it was published in 2014. It's an annotated version of the original manuscript. It's a massive book. It's got tons of primary sources, photos, documents. I've thumbed through it, and I can tell you it's very interesting. It's a lovely book, but I have not found the time to really dive in and read it in its entirety. I think reading that book classifies as a project, but it's out there. And if you read it, you'll see it's very different from what the Little House books became. For today's pairing, I'm teaming that 19th century pioneer Laura Ingalls up with 20th century pioneer Hattie Brooks, who's portrayed in Kirby Larson's Hattie Big Sky, which won a Newbery Honor in 2007. The Newbery is awarded by the Association for Library Service to Children, which is a division of the American Library Association, to the best in children's literature every year. Children's literature is defined by the Association for Library Service to Children as anybody from 0 to 14. And 5 Little House books also won Newbery Honors in their respective years. And those were On the Banks of Plum Creek, By the Shores of Silver Lake, The Long Winter, Little Town on the Prairie, and These Happy Golden Years. So we're talking all about pioneers today. For me, and I think it's fair to say for a lot of us who grew up in the Little House books, or with these Little House books, perception of what pioneer life looked like was shaped by these books. I'm a Pacific Northwest kid, and I grew up in the era when the computer game Oregon Trail was a big thing. So even though the Oregon Trail is not part of my family heritage, certainly that was a huge thing that played out in the history classes and conversations of my childhood. And when I played Oregon Trail, the image I always had in my head was the image that you see on the cover of the edition of Little House on the Prairie that's illustrated by Garth Williams. If you've not seen it, it's just a picture of a covered wagon, and in the back are Laura and her older sister Mary. I should say as an aside, there's been many editions of these books through the years. The ones that a lot of us are familiar with that are still in print today were illustrated by Garth Williams, who you also know from Charlotte's Web and other things, a famous illustrator. Those were actually published in the mid-1950s. And so those illustrations are not original to the books, but many editions have been published with those illustrations, and they are in print to this day. So I had the image of Oregon Trail and the image of this covered wagon from Little House on the Prairie. And what I did not realize at the time, and what I think I've only come to realize lately as I've delved more into historical fiction, is the era of the pioneers in America is long. If you're talking about the West, like west of the Mississippi, it's 75 years. If you talk about the settlement of the Midwest and the East Coast, it goes back much, much further than that. But when you're talking about the pioneers of the American West, that's a 75-year period. So it's a couple of generations. And how and when the pioneers settled the West depended a lot on various land grant acts passed by Congress. So before we get into these books, I want to do a little bit of history about the sort of circumstances behind what shaped what was happening with white settlement of the land west of Mississippi. Because I think we have this image that America was settled from east to west, and it's really not that simple. It's really east, sort of to the Mississippi, and then west, and then in the middle comes last. Actually, Alaska comes last, but that's a different story. The settling of what is now Oregon and parts of Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, that Oregon Territory, has to do with the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850. So this goes back a ways. So settlers in the Oregon Territory could qualify for these huge tracts of land, 320 or 640 acres at the price of $1.25 an acre. The thing about that act was it lasted 5 years. It was a temporary thing. So the settlement of the Oregon Territory is pretty quick. And if you're a history buff, you know the gold rush is causing the settlement of California at pretty much the same time. So you have the established country is the land sort of east of the Mississippi River with some territories kind of on that Mississippi River line. And then you have a rapid settlement happening of the coast. And you've got this kind of not as settled land in the middle. Now, I want to talk about that for a second, too, because we can run into challenges with our language, because I think it's really important to remember, and it happens very quickly when we start to have this conversation, that we wipe out from our language and our memory all the people who lived in that area at that time. We're going to have that conversation in a minute as well. But I want to say before I go on, North America, prior to white settlement, was home to hundreds of tribes. Some areas were more densely populated than others. Some areas were populated by more nomadic tribes who covered larger land areas. But to talk about this land as devoid of people or devoid of culture prior to the coming of the white settlers is insensitive at the least, and gets much, much worse than that. So I want to try really hard. I'm not perfect. I think I've already done it in this conversation. But I want to try really hard to make sure my language is not dismissive of what pre-white settlement in North America looked like. I'm going to try not to be part of that problem. I think pioneer literature and historical fiction of this era is getting better at acknowledging the presence of the people who lived there before, but I will not say that it is perfect, and I think it is still very, very easy to leave Native peoples out of this conversation. So I'm going to try to hold myself accountable to not do that in this conversation. So you have Oregon and California being settled by white people quite quickly. And you have a huge amount of the West in the middle that is a pretty inhospitable place to the kind of settlement that we're talking about, the kind of large tract farming and things like that the Oregon Territory is really conducive to. Nebraska and the Dakotas may be a more difficult place. So if you think about when you're playing the Oregon Trail game, okay, I'm dating myself here, because this game was not an iconic part of everyone's childhood, but it was definitely mine. So for those of you who are my age, think about it for a minute. You started that game by buying supplies. Where were you? I mean, more accurately, you started the game by figuring out you didn't have enough supplies. Where were you? You're in Independence, Missouri. So you go from Independence, Missouri across this really harsh landscape, which, again, if you ever played Oregon Trail, you've got people dying of malaria and covered wagons trying to get across rivers and mountains, and it was a hard trek. But you're covering through all this area. Who came back and farmed it? And when? When did the government start giving away tracts of land in that region? And all of those spaces, Nebraska, the Dakotas, parts of Kansas, Wyoming, Montana, parts of Idaho, present-day Washington, all of that stuff. And the answer to how that land was granted, like most answers in the history of the 19th century, has everything to do with the Civil War. So the southern states had a big interest in kind of small-time farmers, small settlers, stake in land claims out west, because what that does is that takes away these sort of large-scale, big plantation farms owned by the wealthy and companies that have a lot of slaves on them. That was sort of the model for agriculture in the South. And if out west is a more independent, more small-time farmer, more family farms, you're leaving what the South thinks of as their culture and their heritage out of it. And so they were very against settlement in the West because they were concerned that was going to mean more free states and they were going to quickly lose their influence in Congress. And history buffs have heard of the Missouri Compromise, which kind of kept the balance between free and slave states in 1820. By the middle of the 19th century, that's gone because the Kansas-Nebraska Act's been passed, and basically what has been decided is that the people who live in territories that want to become states are the ones who decide whether they're slave states or free states. And so you have the southern states very worried, and so they are clamping down on a lot of small-time farming happening out west. And then they seceded. And very quickly after that, in 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act is a pretty revolutionary piece of legislation. Any U.S. citizen, or a person who wants to become a citizen, who's head of a household, any person was eligible for a land grant. And they were usually 160 acres. That's a lot of land. If they were willing to live on the land and make improvements to it. And so suddenly, huge tracts of land, it would end up being about 10% of the land in the United States would end up being distributed through the Homestead Act. That's a huge amount of land. And that's what opens up opportunities for the Ingalls family. They tried homesteading twice. They tried it in Kansas in 1870. They were either unclear or didn't care that they were on tribal land and eventually got evicted. And they did eventually file their homestead claim in De Smet, South Dakota in 1879. And so it's that journey from Kansas to South Dakota via Wisconsin and Minnesota that Laura would later write about in the Little House books. Now, the actual order of where her family went when was fictionalized for the purposes of the story, because real life Laura was something like 3 years old when she lived in Kansas, and it made more sense for that character to be older at that time. So she skips in her fiction books the Wisconsin to Kansas and back to Wisconsin jump that her family makes, and she just starts in Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to South Dakota to make kind of more of a straight line. It's a challenge to follow the travels of the real-life Ingalls family, for me. Because Charles Ingalls had kind of itchy feet, and he took this family a little bit of everywhere. I will say, if you want more on the real Ingalls family and on the real Laura Ingalls, one of my favorite podcasts is The History Chicks. They have a great format where they take a woman in history, any period, any place, just a woman in history, and they do like 1 or 2 a month, and heavily research her life and then talk you through the story of her life over the course of an episode. And they did a great episode on Laura Ingalls Wilder, which made it was the easiest way I had of following kind of her family's crazy beginnings. So if you want a little more backstory, there's tons of biographies on Mrs. Wilder. And like I said, there's her actual autobiography, Pioneer Girls, out there. But that episode of The History Chicks is also a great way to kind of get a sense of this family's journey. So they finally filed their homestead claim in 1879. By the 1880s, they're settled in De Smet. De Smet's turning into a real town, and their pioneer days are kind of behind them. But the Homestead Act is just getting started. Now, prior to reading Kirby Larson's Hattie Big Sky, I had no thought of pioneers in the 20th century. Nothing like that would have ever occurred to me, but I hadn't met Hattie. Hattie Brooks has picked up the name Hattie here and there. She's a 16-year-old orphan, and she's been shuttled around from relatives she doesn't know very well, who don't actually like her very much. And then an uncle dies and leaves her his homestead in Montana. And so in 1918, she travels out there to finish proving up his claim. Now, don't let the time period fool you. Hattie is doing her homesteading in 1918 rather than 1878. But proving up a homestead is no joke. She's got this chunk of land in the middle of eastern Montana. She's got to sow crops. She's got to lay fence. She's under a deadline. She's dealing with all of the bad weather and bad luck that part of the world can throw at you. And she's a pioneer. The Montana of 1918 is a pretty wild place. It's still new to white settlement. It's amazing to think about how recent the pioneer era in America really is. So I was researching for this episode, and I was shocked to learn how common Hattie's story actually is. I so thought the Homestead Act was a relic of the 19th century. The Homestead Act remained in effect until 1976. And there were provisions under the act to continue homesteading activities in Alaska into the 1980s. This is my lifetime. Now, in the middle of the 1930s, there's a grazing act that's passed that really limits the amount of land available. So most of your 20th century homesteaders are happening prior to that. But more than twice as many final homestead patents, these are people who proved up their claim, were received after 1900 than before. And the biggest decade for homestead claims was 1911 to 1920, which is the decade that Hattie's doing hers. I'll put some links in the show notes with some really cool charts that kind of show you breakdowns of when homestead claims were filed. And homesteading was open to anyone. Immigrants, newly freed slaves after the Civil War, single women like Hattie, people who'd never owned property in their life. The cost to get a claim in dollars was very small. So it's a really, really profound and groundbreaking piece of legislation, but it's also not perfect. Hattie learns this is not easy at all, especially in Montana. So in 1909, Congress amended the Homestead Act to increase the number of acres a homesteader was entitled to. And Montana was in the season of rainy winters, and it was just perfect farming conditions at that time. It didn't last. In 1912, Congress dropped the number of years homesteaders were given to prove up their claim, and about the same time, the Montana weather was doing what it does, which is taking a turn for the worse. So when Hattie inherits her claim, she only has a year to go. They only had 3 years at that time. And here's the odds that she was fighting. 80,000 homesteaders came to Montana between 1909 and 1920. By the late 1920s, 60,000 of them were someplace else. It's really an amazing story. I think the story of the 20th century pioneers is a really untold story. Since reading Hattie, I've come across a few other books, some of them fiction, some of them nonfiction, that cover this time period. But prior to reading Hattie, I personally had never really seen anything like it. Kirby Larson is a local author here. She lives not far from me. And I met her very early in her career. So when I met Kirby, she had 2 books out. She had a picture book and an early chapter book. And our library system that I was working for at the time had an author event where authors came to meet the librarians and basically proposed their author visits, what they would look like if we were to hire them to come visit our library. And Kirby had a great little talk planned. It was aimed at 5 to 9-year-olds. So I booked her to come to my library. At the time I was working on an island, so I sent her ferry tickets and she came across and the whole thing. We had 3 kids show up. All of them were younger than 4. It was awkward. I learned doing the programming at small libraries in that era, the worst thing to do is to have an event and have 1 kid show. Having no kids show is not the worst. That's awkward, and you have to kind of apologize to whoever it is you've hired to come out. But having them have to do their show for 1 kid is really rough. And for Kirby, she has this whole thing prepared, and then she has, like, 2 2-year-olds and a 3-year-old. She would run into me for years after that at events for writers and readers around the area. And I don't think she remembers me anymore, but she would inevitably say, "Oh yeah, you were the librarian at that one school visit with all the toddlers." Yeah, that was me. So Kirby, her career goes back a ways. Hattie Big Sky, though, really jump-started her career. And it comes from her own family history. Hattie Brooks was Kirby's grandmother, or great-grandmother, I can't remember. And so she did the research on her own family history and on her own family story. And she now has a number of books out. There's a sequel to Hattie Big Sky called Hattie Ever After, which I love, because what happens is over the course of Hattie Big Sky, Hattie corresponds with a soldier who's fighting, her buddy Charlie. And after Hattie Big Sky came out, kids would ask Kirby all the time at author visits what happened to Hattie and Charlie. What was their story? Did they get married? Did they live happily ever after? And she told me once she always kind of felt uncomfortable with that question because she felt like Hattie is a more independent person than that. And given how Hattie Big Sky ends, which I won't give away, she sort of thought of Hattie as somebody who was poised for more adventure rather than just kind of settling down and getting married. And so in the end, she wrote Hattie Ever After to sort of answer the questions about what happened to Hattie next. It's well worth the read. In some ways, I think it's even better. I love Hattie Big Sky, but Hattie Ever After is a delicious book. We might cover it on the podcast at some point in the future. So that's how Hattie came to be. Now, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old when Little House in the Big Woods came out. That was her first book. She had written for many years as a newspaper columnist, but that was her first book. By 1943, so a little over a decade, she would have published 8 Little House books. Now, this is where a familiar character walks into our story. I first introduced Ursula Nordstrom, legendary children's book editor, when we talked about Marie Sendak. This is her second appearance on the show, and I don't think it's going to be her last. I just started reading Dear Genius, which is the compendium of her letters that I mentioned in that other episode. And the very first one is to Mrs. Wilder. It's written in 1937. Nordstrom had just become an assistant in the department. I think it was called the Department of Books for Boys and Girls at Harper and Row back in those days. And there were some proofreading issues in the galleys for On the Banks of Plum Creek. And she basically had to write an apology letter to Mrs. Wilder for what had happened, what had gotten by the editors at Harper and Row. And you can tell by the letter that Mrs. Wilder is a big name at this point. She is an important, perhaps the most important author on their list. Now, think about the journey she's been on. Her pioneering childhood, difficult years of her early marriage fighting disease and poverty and losing her infant son. She and her husband finally buy their home and their farm and then basically lose their life savings when the Depression starts in 1929. And then her memoir gets rejected all over town and she starts writing children's books, which is not a very prestigious thing in the world of publishing at this time. And by 1937, at 70, she's a famous authoress. I mean, this is an amazing story. I think it's really inspiring for anyone out there who wants to write the journey of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It's sort of like, if she can do it, anybody can. But I guess not everyone has the talent that Laura Ingalls Wilder was. Now, if you haven't read the Little House books in a while, or if you've never read them, they are worth a read as an adult. They're definitely children's books, and they read as children's books. Hattie Big Sky is on that borderline between, I think, children and adult. It's actually marketed as YA, young adult. Kirby Larson always thought she was writing a children's book when she was writing it. I can tell you, I have given Hattie Big Sky to 9-year-olds. I've given it to teenagers. I gave it to a women's book club, which was 55 plus. I think it really transcends a lot of age groups. The Little House books really do read as children's books. But as an adult, you see them differently, and I reread them. So I read them the first time when I was 5 years old. I went through the whole series the summer before I started kindergarten. Yes, I am that kid. And I came back to them over 20 years later. I had dipped into them. We had an audiobook of On the Banks of Plum Creek when I was a kid, so I listened to that a few times, and it was probably the one I was most familiar with. But I had not sat down and read the series in its entirety since I was 5 years old. And coming back to them over 20 years later was a really interesting experience. And I would recommend it. If these are books that you just kind of dimly remember, think you liked, picking them up again, I think, is well worth the experience. We're going to talk more in upcoming episodes about rereading things that you read as children, because it is a really interesting experience. I think we diminish rereading in this culture. It's sort of like, it's considered a waste of time. You've already done that. Why do you have to go back to it again? And I think it does something interesting to you when you revisit things that you once loved or once hated. So as a child, Big Woods was my favorite. You've got 4-year-old Laura in the Wisconsin woods. That was a character I could relate to. And I'm currently reading it again to my 3-year-old. I will say, approaching Big Woods as an adult with 21st century eyes is a different experience, because I really don't think it would come into print today, at least not in its form. Laura Ingalls Wilder had an eye and an ear for language and detail and sensory details. And I think Big Woods, more than any of the other books, is this sensory experience. There's a whole chapter on this getting ready for winter and this preserving of food and this, all of that. There's a whole chapter on the way Pa treats his gun and how he makes the bullets. And they are so cool. And there's so much minutia and there's so much yummy historical detail in there. But I will say the story doesn't move very fast. Now that changes as the books go on. Part of that is because this narrator, it's a third-person limited narrator. So you're getting Laura's voice, not in first person, but you're getting her voice. And she grows up. So in Big Woods, you're seeing the world through the eyes of 4 and 5-year-old Laura. And one of the things a master storyteller can do that's really hard is to change that voice. So as she gets older, what she's noticing and what she's experiencing is maturing, and these books mature as well. So Big Woods is an interesting place in the series to start because of that. Little House on the Prairie, best known, at least by name, is probably the most problematic of the series in terms of its depiction of Native Americans. Now, what's happening to the Ingalls family at the time of this book is they are trying to settle a homestead on what turns out to be tribal land. And so the clashes between the family and the Native Americans is most prominent in this book. Debbie Reese runs a fabulous blog called American Indians and Children's Literature, and I'm going to link in the show notes to her post about a letter that she discovered in Dear Genius, the book I mentioned earlier, the Ursula Nordstrom book, about the 1950s reissue of the series. So they're getting ready to re-release it with new art, and Ursula Nordstrom gets a letter from someone, I think a parent, asking if Wilder thought the Native Americans were people, because she mentions in Little House on the Prairie that there was no one out there. No one lived out there. Nordstrom asked her if they could change the language, and Mrs. Wilder agreed. And the language that you'll read when you read the book now is, quote, "There were no settlers, only Indians lived there," unquote. Now, as I mentioned before, this is an easy mistake to make. I've done it myself. But that does not make it any less problematic. And there's this underlying racism that comes underneath pretty much any narrative about quote-unquote settling the West. And it's troublesome. It's challenging. It's a challenging thing to deal with. And it's not the only thing that's challenging in this book, Little House on the Prairie. The book includes the phrase, quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," unquote, which is something Ma believes. Now, that phrase did not originate with this book. It was a very common phrase in the second half of the 19th century. It originated with a Union general during the Civil War, and it's said by a lot of people, including Teddy Roosevelt. The fact that the racism isn't original doesn't make it any better. And there is no question that if you share Little House on the Prairie with kids today, it requires some teaching, and it requires some giving of context. There's no mention made in the book of the fact that the Ingalls family is in the wrong here, that they are the ones who are taking land. There's an ethnic and cultural genocide happening in the country at this time that almost is made sort of palatable by the language of this book, and that's not okay. I want to emphasize that's not okay. It's really hard to read books from past eras that are problematic, and Little House on the Prairie is probably the worst offender in the series. It's not the only one. I was reading Little House in the Big Woods to my kid today, and there's a song that Pa sings on his fiddle. Pa is a great fiddler, and you see a lot of his music through the books, and he is singing an old folk song that has the line, "He's gone where the good darkies go." I mean, there's a lot of stuff in all of these books that is a challenge, and I don't think this is not the first and last time we're going to run into this problem if we look at old books. It is really problematic to know where to place books like this in the canon. Now, we live in a time when a lot of artistic works, literature, is being shoved aside, taken out, de-emphasized, removed from curriculum, all of that, because of what is coming to light about their creators, everybody from Dr. Seuss to Sherman Alexie. And that's a really understandable reaction. It is. But it also concerns me because I don't know where it stops. I don't know where you draw the line. And it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard. I'm glad I'm not selecting, honestly. I'm glad I'm not in library selection right now because it's a challenging conversation to have. Little House on the Prairie was released over 80 years ago. It's set nearly 150 years ago. It seems really unfair to ask these characters and this writer to conform to 21st century standards. But I also understand that it's profoundly unfair to ask kids to read depictions about a group of people that are really so dreadful. I mean, it's not nice what is said. So I don't know what you do with that. I mean, do we take it off our shelves? Do we not share it with kids? Do we take away the awards and the honors that Wilder won in her lifetime for these books? I think, ultimately, that's a decision that every person and every parent has to make for themselves. And I can't judge what other people choose to do or not do. My answer is no. I think the book's redeeming qualities make it worthy of sticking around, even if not all of it is comfortable. Not everything is comfortable in this lifetime, unfortunately. And I think, to me, one of my concerns about taking this problematic literature out of the canon is it doesn't let kids in on what our history actually is. It doesn't let them see what it actually looks like and how people were actually treated and how people actually thought and what they have to work to overcome. It's hard for them to know where we have come from if they never get to see it. This isn't related to this topic particularly, but there's a great blog, the Gay YA, about LGBTQ books for teens. And they have a whole conversation about problematic books and the fact that some of the early literature in the LGBTQ area was very problematic by 21st century standards and really, you know, in many ways wouldn't appeal to and maybe shouldn't be read by today's teens. But if it doesn't exist, then all the stuff that comes after it doesn't exist either. So there's some challenges there. So I respond to the parts of this book that are hard by using them as teachable moments. And the other thing that I do that's really important to me is I make sure that my reading and sharing of books involves bringing the perspectives of marginalized people in as well, and making sure that I read literature by and about those groups, and not just, you know, by and about groups that have been left behind and left out, and not just by groups who have done the leaving. I think I have a librarian's attitude towards censorship. We are very, very uncomfortable taking materials away. Librarians are very big on freedom of speech, freedom to read, freedom from censorship, and we take very seriously when we have to take things out of a collection. It's a big deal. We don't do it that often, and we don't do it at all if we can help it. Our response, whenever humanly possible, rather than taking material away, is to add additional material. You know, I think we feel like the more we add to a conversation, the more alternatives you can present, the more alternative perspectives you can present, the better things are understood. So that's what I do. You know, I'm sharing these books with the 3-year-old right now, but I also took a look at lists of books recommended by the American Indians and Children's Literature blog, you know, sort of alternatives to grab instead of some of these books. And I will be reading those as well. And I'm planning on sharing at least one on a podcast episode in a few weeks because I want to make sure we highlight those voices. I want to make sure we're not leaving out voices in this conversation. So that's how I deal with the challenges of a book like Little House on the Prairie, for better or for worse. Book 3 in the series, at least in my edition of the series, is Farmer Boy. Farmer Boy was released in 1933, so it precedes Little House on the Prairie. It's often listed as book 2. In truth, it doesn't really matter. It's an outlier. It's about Wilder's husband's childhood, so it's set in a totally different place and 20 years earlier than the other books. You can read it whenever. And then we jump back into where the Ingalls family is with On the Banks of Plum Creek, which, as I mentioned, was one of my favorites as a kid. And then we do By the Shores of Silver Lake, and then The Long Winter. Now, The Long Winter, of all these books on the reread, The Long Winter was the one that was a real revelation to me. I remember finding it really boring as a child. I thought, oh my gosh, is this winter ever going to end? It's the longest book in the series. And as an adult, it's dramatic. This family is trying to keep from starving to death in one of the worst winters on record. If you as an adult are going to read one book in this series, make it The Long Winter. And then we wrap up with Little Town on the Prairie and These Happy Golden Years. If you're a TV fan, Little Town on the Prairie is probably the book that will align most closely with the TV show. Although, like most adaptations, the TV show moves away from the books pretty quickly. The name of the town in the TV show is Walnut Grove, which is the setting for On the Banks of Plum Creek. But I think the town itself more closely resembles De Smet, which is where they are in the later books in the series. I think, in general, the TV series, from what I remember of it, I haven't seen it in years, but from what I remember of it, it really more closely aligns with the later books in the series. The tone does change over time, as I mentioned. Those meticulous descriptions in Little House in the Big Woods go away. They don't go completely away, but they become less common as the series goes on. Now, depending on which criticism you read, this may have something to do with the partnership or influence of Mrs. Wilder's daughter. So Rose Wilder Lane was also a writer. She typed her mother's manuscripts, and there's a whole bunch of literary debate about how much more, if anything, she did. Was she just the transcriptionist? Did she ghostwrite? Did she heavily edit? And what most critics agree is, however much editing she did, Little House in the Big Woods and These Happy Golden Years have the least amount of her influence. And they, for the 5-year-old Chris, who read them first, were the favorites. So I'm going to leave it to other literary minds to debate who wrote what and when. And all I will say is, as I said before, the voice of Laura going from Little House in the Big Woods as a 4-year-old child to an older teenager in These Happy Golden Years teaching school is a wonderful journey to be on, and so wonderfully written that it makes it easy for me to forgive the series for all its inconsistencies and all its foibles, because I think you are listening to the work of a master storyteller. Now, there is a 9th book in the series, The First 4 Years. It's an add-on, and it has an interesting backstory. I think everything in this whole episode has a strange and interesting backstory. I feel like this is the episode of backstory. So, the manuscript for The First 4 Years was discovered among Mrs. Wilder's papers. It's really unclear whether she intended it to be a part of the series or a standalone, whether she was writing it for adults or juveniles. It deals with the first 4 years of her marriage, which were tough. I mean, they like I said, they fought disease and poverty, and they lost an infant son. And it reads in some ways, it's a little drier. It's shorter than you would think it would be for how much goes into it, because it almost reads a little bit like an outline. It doesn't read like a finished book. It's not bad. I definitely read it. I definitely recommend it. But it's an interesting add-on. Now, Rose Wilder Lane was the only surviving child of the Wilders, and she herself had no surviving children, so there are no descendants of the Wilders. She left her estate, Mrs. Wilder Lane, to Roger Lee McBride. So Lane was a writer herself. She was probably the one who got her mother started in terms of introducing her to important people who would help her get published. If she didn't do any editing, she at least did that. In the lifetime of these women, Lane might have been the better known of the two, although her work was a little, I don't want to say trashier. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think less timeless. Let's put it that way. She was one of the founders of the American Libertarian Movement. She was a big fan of Ayn Rand, and in the 1940s and 1950s, she was part of a group that really got the American Libertarians off the ground. She had known Roger McBride since he was a child. He grew up in the movement. He ended up running for president on the Libertarian ticket in 1976. He's referred to, depending on what you read, as either the adoptive grandson or the political disciple of Lane, and he was her heir. So it was his decision to publish The First 4 Years, basically unedited. Like I say, it doesn't read like a final book, in 1971. And because the papers came into his possession. And it's out there. In addition to libertarian writings, he also wrote a series of books about Rose's childhood in the Ozarks. And it's a little, depending on what edition you get, it's either Little House the Rose Years or Little House the Rocky Ridge Years. I read them as a child. I will honestly say I don't remember them well enough to give commentary. There have been a lot of spin-offs on the Little House books, some of which I've read, some of which I haven't. There are series about Laura's mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother. There's an early chapter book series for younger readers. Whatever Roger McBride did or didn't do to preserve Wilder's legacy, and there's arguments about that, he kept her alive for generations of readers, and she remains very popular to this day. Little House books and all the spin-offs remain very, very popular to this day. So, the history and the literary reality of this series is complicated. and it's inconsistent. And these books have been done to death in terms of spin-offs and adaptations. And you know what? I still love them. I love hearing how Ma dyed her butter with carrot juice to make it pretty and yellow, since winter butter is naturally white. The things you learn from these books. I still want a rag doll like Charlotte, the doll that Laura gets for Christmas when she's 4 years old. I can still see that ramsod house dug out under the grasses of Plum Creek and the worry about the cow's hoof going through the roof. I still love that Almanzo comes to pick Laura up and take her home to her family every week when she's teaching, even though she says she'll never love him in what was probably the first romance I ever read. And I still love historical fiction. That, if nothing else, that is the gift those books gave me. And that's why I love them for all of their complications and flaws. As for Hattie, well, Hattie is set in a different time. And she's written in a different time. And as such, her narrative lacks some of the problematic nature of race relations that are common in pioneer narratives of the 20th century. Which is a good thing. But Hattie is dealing with culture clashes of another sort. World War I is raging, and Hattie worries, for good reason, about her German-born neighbors. And she must worry about herself and the way she is portrayed when she defends her German-born neighbors. In her author's note afterward in Hattie, Kirby Larson tells the story of when she began research in 2003. The day she read about the 1918 merchants referring to sauerkraut as Liberty cabbage, she was also hearing of restaurants changing French fries to freedom fries. Remember that one? How we deal with each other, or don't. How we understand each other, or don't. That was true in the West, in the Homestead days, and it is true now. The more things change, well, it's stories like this that make me wonder how our literature and the relics of our culture will be judged in 50 to 80 years. I think it's easy to underestimate how difficult it is to write historical fiction. We admire the world building of sci-fi and fantasy writers and appreciate the suspense mystery and adventure writers keep us in. But to write good history is more than good memory and good research. The time period you're writing about and the time period you're writing in, they play off each other whether you want them to or not. Memory, both the personal and the cultural, is a tricky thing. So is history. The more we seek to understand it and contain it in the compartments we think it goes in, the messier it gets. And I would say delightfully so. So I'm grateful to Laura Ingalls Wilder, who taught me to love historical fiction at the age of 5, and to many writers since that time, including Kirby Larson, who have kept that love alive. I really hope you enjoyed today's book pairing, and will share it with a friend. If you'd like to hear more, I hope you'll subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play Music, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. I'm always looking to make friends over on Goodreads, where I am at goodreads.com/noextrawords, and where you can always get clues about what I am working on for upcoming episodes. Watch what I'm reviewing, that's what's coming your way. I also love to chat books. I'm at No Extra Words on Instagram, and I've even been known to send a tweet or two from at No Extra Words on Twitter. Next week, in case you haven't heard if you're living in Bookland, is the release of the new Disney movie, A Wrinkle in Time. So we are going wall-to-wall wrinkle for our next episode. We're going to talk about the book. I'm hoping to have a special guest in studio to talk about the fine art of rereading and what it means to reread books from your childhood. We're going to love and hate on adaptations of all sorts, and we will look into the life and times of Madeleine L'Engle as well, this being Women's History Month, and talking about an influential children's book writer of the 20th century. In the meantime, I hope you'll get in touch, view show notes, and give me feedback if you love or hate what I'm doing here at noextrawords.wordpress.com. And I hope you find some good stories of your own in the week to come.